You, darkness of whom I am born, I love you more than the flame. More than the flame that limits the world to the circle it illumines and excludes all the rest. But the dark embraces everything, shapes and shadows, creatures and me, people and nations just as they are. It lets me imagine a great presence stirring beside me. I believe in the night.
Woo. It's been hot out, hasn't it? Do you know what I enjoy having when it's super hot out? Maybe you do too. Nice, cool glass of lemonade. What do you see in the top of my lemonade there? Ice. Kind of cool how it just floats on the top, right? Well, when I see ice floating like that, what do you think it might make me think of? I bet the adults might know this one. Icebergs and how they float. They're so good at this game. Well, you know, an interesting thing is when an iceberg's floating, we all have that image of an iceberg in our mind, right? And we know now because of the Titanic and other things that we're only seeing the very tip of it, right? Does anybody know how much of the iceberg we're really seeing? About 10%. So our lovely minister here has volunteered to help demonstrate this. Do you want to come grab this out for me? You want to? And you're taller, so you might be able to help me. Okay, so we're going to stand in front, or go stand on that side there, and then we're going to make, Nick is going to help us demonstrate our iceberg. So 10%, that's more than we have, right? So here, would you recognize who this person is? Maybe, right? But over 8 years, more of them might be emerging, right? As we've gotten to know them, right? But there's still a lot below the surface. And how would we get to know the person below the surface? What's one way you can think of, Nick?
Like asking questions about who I am?
Yeah, Nick, what's your favorite children's book? I bet I know this one.
Harold and the Purple Crayon.
Which I did hear is out in theaters soon or this weekend. So we might get to know a little bit more. Nick, what is one of the things that brings your heart such joy?
Watching children and people of older generations spend time together.
What's a question you might want to ask, Nick? You have a question? Anybody out there? I'm not going to open it totally, but I'll take a couple questions. Yeah. What's your favorite color?
Like the purple there, the purple crayon.
Yeah. Okay, I've got DC or Marvel.
More of a Marvel fan.
And I love and accept you anyway. Because you all know I'm a Wonder Woman fan. I've probably made that very known. But as we start to ask each other, it can be really scary. And I was thinking actually about a lot of us are getting ready to start a new school year. And it can be really intimidating in a new place. And so you might not want to show all of yourself. You might go right back here, right? And just a teeny part of you showing out. But as you start to get to know each other over time and you're in relationship with one another, if you take those risks, you might start to see what's below the surface. And in turn, people might get to know more about what's below the surface for you as well. So I hope that The next time you're drinking a nice ice cold beverage and you maybe see some ice floating right at the top, you remember that iceberg and you remember that you can be curious. That's a big part of what it means to be Unitarian Universalists, and to look below the surface and to find out how you can get to know friends, neighbors better. And with that, we are going to sing you out and we're going to go search for truth and meaning in Pokemon.
The tip of the iceberg. It's a great concept and metaphor. It's the part we see of the iceberg, of a tree, of the world around us, of each other. It can be very deceiving. It's not the iceberg, nor the tree, nor the world, nor each other. We can spend our time believing it is the reality, but it's not. It's just the tip. If we want the really good stuff, the stuff that makes it all what it really is, we need to go deep. 87% of the iceberg is below the surface. Trees have a whole network of roots connecting them to other roots and fungi and insects. There's another world happening under our feet, which sometimes reaches hundreds of miles. We study the leaves, the bark, and walk in the shade of the tree and think we know the tree. Sometimes I get fooled into thinking what I see on the news is the world I live in. It's a small fraction. As it is with each other, we know so little. I love the tapestry series that we do here. It gives us a glimpse into each other's lives. We learn a little of the things that make each other who they are, who we are. We share the things so different than our own experience. I'm grateful to Missy, Dick, Steve, and Kevin for sharing and taking us deeper into their lives. Thank you to each of you. A few years ago, I got to walk on the ocean floor a few miles from the coast of Australia. It was a whole different world there, the fish, the vegetation. Then this giant fish came up to me and stared into my eyes for a very long time. Its lips alone were 4 times the size of my head. You just don't get that experience on the surface. Last year, I offered to have a homeless woman of color come and live in my house. This has been a deep dive into many cultures, which I only see the tip of. It is very different when you share styles, smells, cultures, a kitchen, interests, and habits. I have learned a ton about myself through this deep dive, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I encourage you, go deep, see and feel what is beneath the tip, what makes it all so complicated and so sublime.
We have 2 readings, and this is the first one. It's called Butter by Elizabeth Alexander. My mother loves butter more than I do, more than anyone. She pulls chunks off the stick and eats it plain, explaining cream spun around into butter. Growing up, we ate turkey cutlets sauteed in lemon and butter and cheese on green noodles, butter melting in small pools in the hearts of Yorkshire pudding. Butter better than gravy, staining white rice yellow, butter glazing corn in slipping squares, butter the lava in white volcanoes of hominy grits. Butter softening in a white bowl to be creamed with white sugar, butter disappearing into whipped potatoes with pineapple. Butter melted and curdy to pour over pancakes, butter licked off the plate with warm 𝗛𝗲𝗀 syrup. When I picture the good old days, I'm grinning, greasy with my brother, having watched the tiger chase his tail and turn to butter. We are Mumbo and Jumbo's children, despite historical revision, despite our parents' efforts, glowing from the inside out, 100 megawatts of butter. Our second reading is a two-voice reading. It's in the back of our hymnal if you're curious, number 660, and it's To Live Deliberately by Henry David Thoreau.
Why should we live in such a hurry and waste of time?
We are determined to be starved before we are hungry.
I wish to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life.
I wish to learn what life has to teach, and not, when I come to die, discover that I have not lived.
I do not wish to live what is not life. Living is so dear.
Nor do I wish to practice resignation unless it is quite necessary.
I wish to live deep and suck all of the marrow of life.
I want to cut a broad swath, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms.
And if it proves to be mean, then to get the whole and genuine meanness of it and publish its meanness to the world.
Or, if it is sublime, to know it by experience and to be able to give a true account of it. If you don't know, I am a sucker for good metaphors. I spoke about this last year, and well, it is a recurring confession of mine. But let me clarify, I don't love all metaphors, just the good ones. And there are good ones. You know the ones I'm talking about? I love the metaphors that can paint an image worth 1,000 words, that can open our minds and hearts to the beauty of complexity that is the complex beauty of life, which moves us away from either or thinking towards a more pluralistic worldview and inspire us into action. When we let metaphor in, our lives are enhanced and our commitments transformed. The iceberg invites such enhancement and transformation. The iceberg, which Sandra explored in her reflection this morning, is ironically a living, breathing metaphor. It is not inert, but alive with rich resource for one another and our world today. The iceberg has been in our cultural imagination for at least a century, since the 1912 sinking of the Titanic and popularized in the 1997 Academy Award-winning film of the same name. But the power of metaphor moves us out of the Arctic icy waters of the 20th century and into the everyday applicability of the image in our lives here in the 21st. Because, and I'm just guessing here, that if any of us, are to ever stumble upon an iceberg along our journeys, for nearly all of us, this would be more so metaphorically than literally. Personally, I was trying to remember this week the first time I was introduced to an iceberg, to the iceberg metaphor, not like an iceberg. And while I am sure it was earlier than this, I do recall clearly learning about it in anticipation of a short-term study abroad program I took in Japan. I remember at the orientation for all study abroad participants, imagine a room of 100 or so college students, included important information around the assumptions and stereotypes we may hold and bring with us about different cultures than our individual ones that we brought. The training invited us to consider, like a real iceberg, all that lies beneath the water's surface, whether that is regarding our individual, communal, societal, national, or global existence. It was an invitation to not erase cultural difference. but to instead celebrate our multicultural, interdependent world that we live. It's a powerful image, right? That when we adrift at sea, come upon an iceberg, when we experience, what we experience is just the tip of the gigantic, awesome, mysterious, and sacred reality that is just out of sight. In a sense, the iceberg is a very large metaphor and a very small one in that it can be applied to small and huge concepts, from the individual to the universal, and from life to death and everything in between. Yet, this is understandable. Life deserves such metaphors. We deserve such metaphors. The sacredness of the universe requires such evocative language that can invite us to explore at once mystery and transcendence and that which is empirical and immanent. After World War I, as the world shrunk due to globalization, the creation of the United Nations, the necessity of the iceberg skyrocketed. We also, many more people than before, were able to access international travel. Organizations like the Peace Corps and AmeriCorps, founded in 1961 and 65, respectively, championed the iceberg metaphor, especially after anthropologist Edward T. Hall applied the metaphor to culture in 1975. But indeed, it has been applied to many disciplines before and since, including psychoanalysis, referring to Freud, of course, notion of the conscious and unconscious reality, that duality, and the breakdown of our human id and ego and superego. But let's leave Freud for another day. Why am I telling you all of this? Well, it is important for us to understand that when we are confronted with a metaphor, or even crash into one, such as the iceberg, we do so not by coincidence. On the contrary, often our expeditions as individuals and communities that lead us to encountering difference, nuance, and uncertainty are not linear and defined, but instead coordinated and consequential, with eddies and currents, some of our making, others that we come upon, yet all of which invitations to turn back or to carry on. In other words, we encounter difference not by accident, but because we seek such encounter. We value it, we prioritize it, and say yes to the resulting transformation the encounter inspires. As a congregation, we are a microcosm of our multicultural, pluralistic world. We are each and collectively an iceberg of beautiful proportions. We have depth, true depth into the mind, heart, and spirit of who we are, of where we have come from, and where perhaps our journeys will lead us on from here. And when we encourage one another and practice the art of diving, of going deeper, the values and commitments of our little microcosm here, of the sanctuary, this sanctuary of beloveds, can ripple out and participate in the great unfolding of love that is at the heart of who we are as Unitarian Universalists. We can choose, as Henry David Thoreau argued, to live deliberately, to live in a way that allows us each to say with confidence that in this life we truly lived. We lived. Unfortunately, such a life is not so easy to attain. Am I wrong? Are any fully actualized individuals? It is hard in my experience to name and honor my own 90% of who I am in my wholeness beneath the surface, let alone the challenge to remain open, curious, and focused on the full beauty and sacredness of all that is beyond me. It is human nature, after all, but it is also societal nurture that fosters such distracted and individuated lives. Humans are surely filled with complexity and multitude. Evolutionarily, perhaps, and hereditarily, we get this nuance that shapes a large part of who we are as individuals, yes. But society, culture, and all that comes with them play such an influential role as well. If we are each an iceberg, then society is the water in which we swim. I'll say it again. If we are each an iceberg, then society is the water in which we swim, or bob. We know that phrase, the water in which we swim. You have heard it before? In his 1996 novel, Infinite Jest, David Foster Wallace shares a parable that goes like this. There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys." I'm assuming that's how he sounded. "Morning, boys. How's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" A decade later, in 2005, Wallace recalled this story during his commencement speech at Kenyon College, explaining, quote, "The point of the fish story is merely that the most obvious, important realities are often the ones that are hardest to see and talk about." He goes further towards the end of his speech, reminding the soon-to-be graduates, quote, "The capital T truth is about life before death. It is about the real value of a real education, which has almost nothing to do with knowledge and everything to do with simple awareness, awareness of what is so real and essential, so hidden in plain sight all around us all the time that we have to keep reminding ourselves over and over, this is water. This is water." The story and meaning of this complementary metaphor of the water in which we swim, or should we say the water in which our icebergs float, demands of us a bifocal lens of looking not just at all that is beneath the water's surface, but to the water itself. For we must not forget the answer to wondering how icebergs float is twofold. The iceberg floats due to the size and density of what is below the surface and the water in which it floats. Excuse me. And the second is the water itself and the density that it has in relationship to the iceberg. I want to be sure to clarify that this isn't a chicken or the egg binary or simplistic matching of metaphors, but rather that each element, ice and water, invite a significant lifelong consideration and commitment. As mentioned above, ours is a religion where we encourage our questioning and exploration, a religion where we anticipate inspiration. We anticipate it. Inspiration and exploration. Religion where we can all grow and change through life and commit to live lives of integrity, service, and joy. As such, here we can and do look beneath that space where air meets water to a fuller sense of who we are together. And what is also true is that this community, UUCCI, in this community, we expect and encourage one another to name the water itself. For those of us who live in the matrix of privilege and oppression, that's all of us, it is easier and or harder to ignore the water, more or less. Sometimes the more privileged identity markers one has corresponds to an easier ability to avoid naming the water or thinking about it, and vice versa. For example, as a man, I don't have the same constant awareness of the dangerous waters those who can become pregnant swim in due to the overturning of Roe and the increasing draconian laws passed that criminalize their bodily autonomy. It is easy for me to forget that reality, that fear and threat is faced by tens of millions of people, including loved ones in my family and in our congregation, not just some days, but every day. Similarly, as a white person, it is easy for me to forget about the racist and xenophobic quality of the water Easy to just keep on bobbing there as an iceberg, not aware of the millions of people who are affected by our immigration and policing policies, or by the prison industrial complex. And that ease of forgetfulness is a threat to both the perpetuation and continuation of ongoing oppression against others in our global family, but it also, and this is important, it also jeopardizes my own humanity and my own path for liberation. You see, I believe our humanity, this universal sacredness of existence, and by extension, our liberation and full actualization, is interdependent. Interdependence, we say that word a lot, but interdependence is one of our values as Unitarian Universalists, and it has been for a long time. It was newly affirmed in our UU values at General Assembly this year, but it was also in our UU principles for decades. Interdependence is a value that calls me to name the water, to name it, knowing we do not all traverse it the same way and with the same ease. And it calls all of us to double down, to go all in on our commitment to multiculturalism and pluralism, because, and this is important as well, these things aren't inevitable, but fostered. Multiculturalism and pluralism are not inevitable, but fostered like an aquatic ecosystem that is both fragile and fecund, that is both treacherous and glorious, that can both drown and lift us up into a reality of love that we can barely imagine. Yes, indeed, perhaps a reality that we can imagine, but just the tip of such a future. My friends, when we go deeper into the waters of life, it may get colder and darker, but it is in that holy quiet, in that enveloping darkness, that we can be fully seen and heard. It is in that place that we can see and hear one another and those beyond these walls. And when we inevitably come up for air, when we rise again to the space where water now meets air, we can and will breathe with more gratitude for the interdependent life we share with all of life, with all who have lived and now live. What a breath that will be. Take a breath. Now let's go deep. May it be so, and amen.